Sorry.
Welcome, Mary. No worries. I know Malika's just getting us started here and we've got folks joining, so no problem. Thank you for joining us.
It's been one of those days. And then somebody in my class had a question right when I was, and then I had to restart my computer. So we're all good now.
I had a similar situation, Mary. I had to run from a press conference in Golden Valley, but
Yeah, I hope your plan is to fail that student, Mary.
What?
I hope your plan is to fail that student.
Let's hope not, Andrew.
I might be being a little bit dramatic, but that's okay.
Is it broadcasting live yet?
Yes, we are live.
So we can go into LRC and pull it up so we can share it.
I don't know if it's being broadcast live yet to Facebook, but it should be momentarily if it's not yet.
Got it.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening. My name is Sarah Davis. I'm the Executive Director at the Legal Rights Center, and I would like to welcome you this evening to our third forum focused on community perspectives on justice and the Chauvin murder trial. We really appreciate both Nekima Levy Armstrong and Mary Moriarty and joining Andrew Gordon and I here from the Legal Rights Center today. I'm just going to take a quick moment to introduce everyone. Malika, if you want to move us forward. So we have Andrew Gordon with us this evening, and he is our Deputy Director for Community Legal Services at the Legal Rights Center. Andrew we're very lucky to have Andrew at the LRC. He's from Kingston, Jamaica, and has been in Minnesota for quite some time and has dedicated his legal career to representing folks who have been disempowered and marginalized by the criminal legal system. We also this evening have Nekima Levy Armstrong with us. She's a civil rights attorney, activist, national expert on racial justice, former law professor and legal scholar. She's the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, and she's the founder of the Racial Justice Network. And then we also have Mary Moriarty with us this evening. She was the former chief Hennepin County public defender. She's a well-respected faculty member of Gideon's Promise for the past 15 years. She's received numerous awards and is on the faculty of trial advocacy workshops and clinics across the country. I could go on and on about our panelists this evening, but I won't because there's so much to talk about. We're just 3 days into evidence in this trial and we have a lot to cover, but really grateful to these three folks for being here with us this evening. At the Legal Rights Center, we are focused on providing community support throughout this trial process, and these forums have been a piece of that. So many of you have been here with us before, and we welcome you back and welcome some new folks for joining us this evening. So as we get started, I just want to start by acknowledging that this trial continues to be incredibly difficult and triggering. I say that as a white woman, and I acknowledge that that pales in comparison to what's being experienced by our Black community members. It is incredibly, I just want to acknowledge how much of yourselves, Nekima and Andrew in particular, and Mary also joining us this evening, you're giving to us in our community by continuing to engage in these conversations. And one of the things that we've heard from community members is the importance of self-care throughout this trial. So I just wonder, as we get started here, if you're comfortable, if you might talk a little bit about how you're taking care of yourself throughout this trial. And again, just to acknowledge our deep gratitude to you for being here. So if anybody would be comfortable sharing that, I know that's something that's really important for our community.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very blessed to be here with you all tonight. Typically, lawyers don't do very well when it comes to self-care. Many of us work way too hard and we rest way too little. But several years ago, when I was a law professor at St. Thomas, I started thinking about this notion of self-care and being intentional and teaching my law students to do the same. So now, I will light candles, I will take trips when I need to, I will meditate, and also just find the time to relax and to be intentional about that.
Yeah, I will echo what Sarah said. I speak from the perspective of a white woman, and I have just been, I can't even quite describe how I've felt the last 2 days. Everybody's seen the video, and noticed the bystanders there and heard what they've said. But yesterday and today, we have actually met them and we've heard them tell their stories. And we've heard about each and every one of them talking about the trauma that they experienced from being there and witnessing this and watching this, and the grief and the guilt. And so I think about that a lot. Although I can't imagine what it's like to be in that position, I also can't imagine as a white woman what it's like to be a Black member of our community right now. And so I do think about that a lot. I hope, I've been thinking a lot about, are the people who testified being offered help at some point? I hope that they are getting cared for. I hope that people in our community are, because I can only imagine how difficult this has been.
Yeah, and I think the contribution I would make to this would be that we've seen witnesses break down, right? And I think part of the self-care that those of us in the community who are not participants in the trial can practice is to give ourselves that space. If that means breaking down, if that means taking a moment to collect ourselves, if that means taking a moment to cry, then take that moment. Kind of like Nekima mentioned earlier, I'm not very good at providing myself that space. And so my distraction during the trial itself has been to work. So I do my day job, while the trial is going on. And that's acted as a little bit of a distraction. It's worked so far. I can't imagine it's going to work 2 weeks from now as this process continues. And so I'm going to have to be better about that myself. But I think the encouragement I would give to folks is to take that time to step back. This is not an easy process by any stretch of the imagination. It will likely get worse. I don't know if there's space to talk about this, but we haven't yet gotten to, for example, the autopsy and the issue of autopsy photos being published live to the world. And so take that space and take that time. You owe it to yourself to be able to fully process what's going on. And I think I'm appreciative generally of Nekima and Mary and then the organization for doing this, providing this space in part to help process what we're seeing.
I completely dodged the question about self-care because I'm very good at talking to other people about doing it. I'm not always good about doing it myself, but in thinking about it, one of the things that's helped me, actually, I'm on leave right now, and it's helped me incredibly trying to help people in the community understand the process that's actually happening. I'm trying to do that on Twitter and when I get offered opportunities to speak about it and write about it. Because being a lawyer and being inside the system and knowing how things work is hard. But I can only imagine what it's like when you're trying to understand what these terms mean, what's happening. And so part of my contribution, and at least something that's helping me get through this, like I'm feeling like I'm trying to be useful, is using the experience I've had in the past 30 years to try to help people understand what's happening as we all go through this.
Let me just jump in here real quick, Sarah, because I think you were just looking at the chat. We actually had a question from one of the attorneys in our office with respect to who's supporting the mental health and the well-being of the individuals who have testified so far. And we started doing a search with respect to figuring out whether there were GoFundMes, fundraisers planned to support those folks. The one we did find was for Judea, who was, I think, the youngest witness who testified yesterday. And that link has now been shared, I think, twice in the chat. And I know that there are community members, because I've spoken to them, who are actively trying to engage with the Attorney General's office, with the Hennepin County Attorney's office, etc., to figure out what are we doing to support these witnesses, the people who are coming forward, who were there, who saw George Floyd murdered, and now have to relive that trauma by testifying about it again. And so I think the LRC will be collecting that information and sharing it out as well. I know there are community members who are doing the same. I think we can all contribute to those efforts as we find them.
Well, I just really appreciate all of you taking a moment to share that out and the vulnerability that you're bringing to this space. Lawyers are not great at self-care, and you've got a bunch of lawyers on here, but I think, you know, everything that we hear from folks is just about how difficult this has been. And I appreciate you talking about what you're doing, and really just continuing to bring your full self to the space. We are, you know, tonight we're going to talk about what we've heard just in these first 3 days of the evidence that's been presented in the trial, and we invite questions throughout. We'll do our best to get to them. The first, you know, we started with opening statements on Monday, and you know, that was very difficult to listen to, you know, for a variety of reasons. And so I wonder if you know, if you might reflect a little bit on what you heard there, and what you took out of the opening statements. And I just open it up to any of you to jump in on that.
I couldn't help, I mean, it was interesting to me that the state started out with a picture of Minneapolis Police Department badge and logo, and something that I wrote down: in your custody is in your care. And I couldn't help but then, that was actually the second time I'd seen the bystander video, because I was only able to watch it once. And the juxtaposition of what MPD was doing in that space compared to what they're supposed to be doing really struck me. I thought, it was actually, you know, it's hard as a lawyer, and I don't know, Nekima or the rest of you guys, how you feel about this, but, and especially as a teacher too, to not critique things as like, how was that as an opening statement? In fact, I was just talking to my students. I had class right before this, and we were critiquing the opening statements. And so that's different from listening to it emotionally. And I knew certainly that the defense was going to argue that George Floyd died of an accidental overdose. And so that wasn't anything new. What was new to me actually was this argument that somehow the people standing there pleading, begging, doing whatever they could to get George Floyd help were going to be characterized as some kind of unruly mob. And I won't forget the term that was used, that they interfered with the officers' ability to care for George Floyd. That was stunning, actually, to me. And it made me listen and really think about even more when I heard each of the stories of the bystanders. And when I watched them standing there helplessly, and when Tao was pushing them back, they would step to the sidewalk. I mean, it was just, you know, sometimes you say things in opening that really come back to hurt you. And I think that will. Because portraying those people as some unruly mob that was preventing any of those officers from helping George Floyd was pretty ridiculous.
I would agree with what Mary just said. I think one of the things that surprised a lot of people in the state's opening statement was the fact that they corrected people's notion of how long George Floyd was under Derek Chauvin's knee. Most people thought it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but the prosecution team made it clear that it was actually 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So even longer than what we thought. 8 minutes and 46 seconds was already far too long. None of it ever should have happened in the first place, but it just adds a whole other dimension to think about the length of time that George Floyd needlessly suffered. I thought that the prosecution also did a great job of humanizing George Floyd, coming right out, packing a punch, and putting that video right in the face of the jurors and reminding them what this was all about and what George Floyd's last moments upon this earth actually looked like and felt like. And I know that it was triggering for many of us to watch the video again. I had seen it, of course, right when it happened last year. I also went to the courthouse when they allowed people to come in and view the body camera footage. So, you know, once again, it took me right back to where I was on May 25th when I first saw the video, in terms of just the trauma and just the sorrow and thinking about what George Floyd experienced. And to Mary's point about the defense team, we knew that their focus was going to be on portraying George Floyd as being responsible for his own death. They alluded to that throughout their opening statement. We know that there's going to be dueling expert witness testimony that comes forward on both sides in order to argue what is causation, in order to prove, you know, why and how George Floyd actually died. I believe that that's going to be very triggering for the community as this information comes forward.
Yeah, as a segue from Nekima's point just now, and I think Mary would agree with me because I believe she commented on this on Twitter before. The standout thing for me during the opening statements, and I say this as a defense attorney, is that that's an opportunity for you to humanize your client, to talk about that person as an individual, and to introduce that person to the juries who are going to ultimately decide their fate. And I think it was instructive that you didn't see a lot of that from Chauvin's defense team. There was a lot of talk about George Floyd in that opening and not a lot of talk about Derek Chauvin. And that's typically a time that you would see a defense attorney do that. And so that stood out to me.
Well, we still don't know who Derek Chauvin actually is. I'm not sure if we'll know by the end of this trial. I know that the more I watched those bystander videos, the more I kept thinking, what kind of household was Derek Chauvin raised in? What kind of community did he grow up in that produced a monster? Typically, we see the demonization of Black children and Black families in Black neighborhoods, but Derek Chauvin's conduct certainly holds up a mirror to white America to cause you to ask the question of what kind of people are being produced in some of these environments. That's what I kept thinking.
You know, it's interesting today when, geez, it's been a lot. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name now. He was the man who was talking. He stayed with George Floyd and he was talking with him, and he confronted Chauvin after. Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah.
When he broke down on the stand after, when he watched the video and of what happened to George Floyd, and the camera panned back to him, and his head was on the table and he was just sobbing, and they had to take a recess so he could have some time. But, the camera frequently looks at Chauvin to see what his reaction is to things like that. And he doesn't seem to have a reaction, which is interesting to me. You do wonder, how can you, and as a defense lawyer, I know you spend a lot of time talking to your client about what it's going to be like in the courtroom. And especially if they're not going to testify, you really do talk about how, like I spend time talking to clients, do you like basketball, football, or whatever it is, and trying to talk with them and engage them to show the jury, see them smiling and that kind of thing. And I haven't seen any of that from Chauvin. It's been the same face, or this stone face, no reaction. And I was only wondering today, what are the jurors making of that? This emotional testimony about what these people saw and the trauma and the guilt that they all feel, and the sadness and the grief, and seeing this man with his head on the table just sobbing, and he has no reaction. I wonder what the jurors are making of that, because they're watching him all the time to see what his reaction is.
Right, but I don't want to assume that all of the jurors are reacting to emotional testimony and weeping of Black people in the same way. So often when we cry, when we feel pain, white America is desensitized to our pain. And that's part of how George Floyd wound up dead. The officers disregarded his humanity as he cried out in agony, as he said he couldn't breathe. They treated him like an inanimate object. And that is consistent with the way that Black bodies have been treated since our ancestors were forcibly brought here. And so I'm not sure that all the jurors can even empathize because of the depths of white supremacy in desensitizing white people to our pain.
I really appreciate that comment, Nekima. For me, when I heard this comment in opening statements from the defense about that the crowd somehow distracted Chauvin and the other officers from, direct quote, from their care of George Floyd, to say that I was shocked by that framing would be an understatement. And for me, it really reflects deeply racist ideas and deeply racist messaging and dehumanization, right? This idea that somehow what Derek Chauvin was doing in that moment was reflecting care for a human being is so, it's so deeply problematic. And I think that reflects what you're saying. I wonder if you and others might comment a little bit on what we expect going forward on, to hear about this concept of care and the concept of fear and, to your point, Nekima, how white supremacy plays into all of that, what we might expect and what people might hear going forward.
Well, they're playing on a lot of stereotypes that have existed for a very long time. I mean, as someone who grew up in Los Angeles, I kept thinking about the way that Rodney King was portrayed 30 years ago when a bystander video caught all of those officers kicking and beating him and stomping him and treating him like he was not human. And the fact that they used this notion of the big scary Black man that they couldn't contain as the justification for their dehumanizing treatment of Rodney King. So this was triggering for me in listening to the defense attempt to even draw a comparison in size between George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, as if that justified Derek Chauvin pressing his knee into George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It's playing on these stereotypes. And when we look at the jury composition, we have to remember that the jury is almost half and half white and people of color. But when you break down the people of color on the jury, 4 of them are considered Black, 2 are considered native-born Black people. There's 1 Black woman who has ties to law enforcement. And then there's 2 mixed race people whose racial and ethnic identities we don't know. And so we don't know how, we can't assume because people are people of color that they're even processing the information in the same way as someone who had a nexus to the type of experience that George Floyd had, being, for example, a native-born African-American, and the unique way that we have been treated by law enforcement, and the fact that law enforcement has its roots in the institution of slavery.
I have a question, and this kind of goes from what Sarah was saying. When there was cross-examination of Donald Williams, it seemed to me that there was a concerted effort to make him angry, like kind of to portray him as an angry Black man. And it, at times, he was talking about the names that Donald Williams was using, and it started out with calling him a bum, and it was like, I mean, it didn't make any sense to me. But do you think that the state or the defense is going to try to argue that this Black man was somehow a danger or a threat to the police officers because he was standing there on the curb yelling things at them, trying to get them to help George Floyd. Because the cross-examination seemed to be, saying, well, you were angry. And it was kind of like, well, who wouldn't be angry? And I was trying to think of what he was getting at. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were.
Well, I think that he's playing upon racist stereotypes about Black people being loud, being angry, being a threat, wanting to beat up or fight cops. I mean, we heard those notions throughout the questioning and statements of the defense, particularly of the witnesses on day 2. But day 1, just as Sarah alluded to, and I think you also talked about, Mary, we could tell the direction that the defense was going in terms of trying to blame the crowd, blame the bystanders, blame the people who are responsible for us all knowing what actually happened to George Floyd, for contributing to his death, and claiming that, police were so distracted by these loud, angry people that they couldn't really focus on what was happening to George Floyd. That is one of the most absurd arguments I think I've ever heard. And anyone with a beating heart will have to look at that and think about whether it actually makes sense. The defense talked a lot about common sense. Well, common sense is missing from that argument for anyone who has seen these bystander videos, and the passion and the relentless pursuit of pushing for the survival of George Floyd is what we see from those bystanders. And they were a lot nicer than I would have been. I mean, as God is my witness, I'm thankful I was not there, because I don't know what I would have been capable of in that moment. And I'm typically able to exercise restraint when I need to, but I don't know if I would have had even an ounce of the level of restraint that those bystanders had, watching the life literally be choked out of a Black man in broad daylight.
Just as a follow-up to kind of this discussion and conversation, I think what's interesting to me as we talk about what the questions are revealing of kind of the defense strategy is that I'm guessing here that the questions that we're hearing and that we're talking about now are effectively a proxy for what you would hear from Chauvin if he were to testify, right? So you're getting questions about distraction and about the crowd, because if Chauvin took the stand and testified himself, that's what you would be hearing him say. And it's an interesting, from a purely defense attorney perspective, it's an interesting kind of tactical consideration where you can see Eric Nelson and the defense team trying to figure out, is this argument working? And if they believe it is it then safe to put Chauvin on the stand, right? And that's what's going through my head as I'm watching the proceedings. And I'm seeing people in the community on Twitter, on Facebook, talking to people, react poorly to it. And I think it would have been easy as a defense team to conceive that the general public, the community members who have been traumatized by the Minneapolis Police Department for so long would have reacted poorly to that. And it goes, I think, to a disconnect between what law enforcement thinks is appropriate and what the individuals who effectively set themselves up to side with and defend law enforcement, just how disconnected they are from what I think is really going on in the community, what's really going on in the streets. That this line of questioning wasn't nipped in the bud from the get-go, because I think it reflects poorly. I shouldn't say it reflects poorly, because I think ultimately Nekima's right. I think you have a number of individuals who are, they have no interest in understanding the plight and the trauma that they've caused the Black population of Minneapolis and elsewhere. They just don't care. And so when you have questions like these come up, they're asking them and they're prodding with these questions, and it's done in a way that is callous, it's reckless, it's wanton, much like the actions of Derek Chauvin were callous and wanton and reckless and showed a complete indifference to human life.
There's a question that came in through the chat that I think sort of dovetails a little with this conversation about, you know, Andrew, that you brought up around what is the defense strategy here. Someone asked, you know, is there a strategy behind not trying to humanize Chauvin, or does that reflect the fact that like it's not important to their strategy? Mary, I know you and I have talked a little bit offline about not being really clear on what is the defense strategy here. And so I wonder, you know, I wonder if someone can answer that question that's come in from the audience.
When I was listening to the defense opening, I was really surprised actually, because he spent the first, I don't know how long, talking about reasonable doubt. And generally, when you're giving an opening or a closing, you want your theory out there, meaning, you know, what is your defense pretty quickly. And you want to tell a narrative about that is in opposition to what your opponent is talking about. In this case, the state did a pretty decent job, especially using visuals in the video, of telling us what their case was about. And I don't think you can stand up as a defense and say reasonable doubt, because the jurors have no idea what to hang their hat on. What are you saying about reasonable doubt? What should I have reasonable doubt about? I've seen all of this stuff. And they made a lot of just conclusory statements like Chauvin did what he was trained to do, which made me wonder, well, what was he trained to do? Because the state just blew up the MPD policy in big letters that told me what they were trained to do in the policy. And so it was not particularly effective in telling us their narrative of what's happening here. I do know, and I think I saw this in the chat, their theory for a long time, if you've read their motions, is that George Floyd had a weakened heart. He had drugs in his system, which nobody denies. That's never been an issue here. And that it was his adrenaline and his struggling against the police that caused essentially an accidental overdose. That's what they've been arguing all along. It is certainly contrary to what the medical examiner is going to testify to. I did notice in opening, the defense made some statements about what the medical examiner was going to say, which were taken completely out of context. So I think the medical testimony is going to be very important to the state in terms of, I am hoping that they're really going to break it down and make sure that everybody understands that, yes, as Dr. Baker actually said in some memo I read, death came to George Floyd more quickly because he had the drugs in his system and because he had a weakened heart. But make no mistake about it, he died. The cause of his death was the restraint and the knee and the compression by the officers. So I expect the state to be very clear about that. And I think it should be an uphill climb for the defense, but that is their theory, that because it does require in all three offenses charged for the state to prove that Chauvin and the other cops' actions was a substantial cause of death. I'm sure that the state is going to be reminding people of what we call the Eggshell Doctrine. It doesn't matter that George Floyd had used drugs. It does not matter that he had a weak heart. What matters is, did the actions of the police officer, were they a substantial cause of his death? So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about that.
Thanks, Mary. I wonder if we could turn a little bit to talk about some of the witnesses that we heard from. Yesterday, I know, was a particularly difficult day for a lot of folks listening to children recount their experiences. You know, and I know we've talked a little bit about the trauma of that. You know, are there specific considerations that, you know, folks should be thinking about when you have children taking the stand? We talk a little bit about the importance of that. Should there be a guilty finding, and, you know, the impact of having children there? Wonder if you know, Nekima or Andrew or Mary, if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on having children testify and the impact here.
I think that the testimony of those young people was particularly powerful. It was also very emotional. Hearing them weep in between their responses to the prosecution team as they were asking questions. And for me personally, as a mother, I was heartbroken thinking about the fact that these children have in some ways held themselves responsible for what happened to George Floyd. Hearing Darnella Frazier, who is the now 18-year-old who captured that bystander video that's been seen around the world. She was only 17 at the time. She talks about the fact that she talks to George Floyd some nights and she apologizes to him for not physically intervening. That made me so sad to hear her say that, to hear her weeping as she said that, and knowing that she's carrying so much guilt for something that she was not responsible for. Derek Chauvin was responsible. Those other 3 officers were responsible. The Minneapolis Police Department played a role in terms of letting Derek Chauvin get out of hand, and elected officials, and then the general public in terms of not being more responsive when you're seeing these videos and hearing these stories about people being killed. But that young woman was not at all responsible for what happened, but that is what she takes with her. And I believe that many of the witnesses have that same sentimentality, from the firefighter to Donna Williams, to one of the other young ladies who was testifying as well. And that's just sad to me that they carry that burden unnecessarily.
You know, we knew that the last couple of days would be hard, like not go well for the defense, and be good for the state's case because, unfortunately, of the emotional testimony. But I have to say, when you're the defense, your goal is to weather that kind of testimony and try to get to the parts that you can do something about. But I have to say, and Sarah, I think you and I were talking about, you try not to inflict damage on your own case. And so Nekima, that only came up, what Darnella said, because the defense asked her, so you took this video, you posted it on Facebook, it went viral. And then he said, it changed your life. And I don't know if the implication was somehow she became a celebrity. I have no idea.
Yeah,
you know, as a lawyer, yeah, it's you don't ask the question to which you don't know an answer. And I can't believe, it was just stunning to me that he asked that question, because then her answer was just what you said, which was absolutely devastating. That actually did come up in the direct testimony that was elicited because of the defense sort of implying that this video had made her some kind of celebrity. And so I think that was really damaging. I mean, not that the rest of the testimony wasn't damaging, but that was a self-inflicted kind of, I don't know what he was thinking there, because I think everybody probably felt, or I mean, most people felt that way, how awful it was that this young woman who just happened to be there with her young cousin. It's just devastating that she's praying and apologizing to George Floyd for what she feels she didn't do.
Well, and let's think about her actions from the beginning. The fact that she was walking with her 9-year-old cousin, 2 cup foods, and she sees what is some type of commotion happening with the officers, and she walks her cousin to the front of the store to try to shield her from the police brutality that she had just witnessed. And as soon as she got her cousin safely into the store, she turns back around, goes back to the scene, putting her life on the line with those aggressive officers as a young Black girl, and she takes out her phone and starts to record, and she doesn't let up. All that time, she's just standing there recording. Every now and then she would chime in, but she talked about the fact that she has social anxiety. Normally, she is not a loud person, but from time to time, she spoke up and challenged what the police were doing. But that took such an incredible amount of courage and faith and compassion to put herself in that circumstance. So we have to honor that. And then even seeing the 9-year-old, you know, who had the word love on her shirt when the police were doing anything but showing love in that moment. And her testimony, she reminded me of in the case of Jamar Clark, who was killed in 2015 in North Minneapolis by Minneapolis police, The youngest witness in that case was a 10-year-old child who, when he saw police officers shoot Jamar Clark in the head at point blank range, he ran back into the house and he said, "Mom, they're killing us." That was his immediate thought after seeing a Black man killed by police. And then that child had to walk by the tree where Jamar Clark was killed every single day to get on the school bus, right? So this trauma is something that our kids have to live with. Those who witnessed this, those who are in the courtroom, and also our kids in the general population, because they see us as parents grappling with these issues, facing trauma. And there is something called vicarious traumatization that can impact those around us, including our children, as a result of what we're going through.
I was also thinking about Christopher Martin's testimony today. Something that I had no idea of, and I'm not sure how many people did, but that we now know that it may be that George Floyd had no idea that he had passed a counterfeit bill. That Christopher Martin, in his opinion, it was the passenger in the car because he had tried to pass a counterfeit or a fake $20 before that. And that Cup Foods actually made Mr. Martin walk out and try to get George Floyd to come back in because they were going to take it out of his paycheck. And, you know, to hear Christopher Martin talk about the conversation he had with George Floyd, and speak about George Floyd very compassionately, actually, and be willing to just, because he didn't think George Floyd knew that this was a fake bill, that he was willing to let it go and have it taken out of his own check, and then decided that maybe he should tell his supervisor. And then to hear, I'm stuck with the picture in my mind of him on the video standing there with his hands on his head, and the state asked him, "What were you thinking?" And it's shock and disbelief. He is now living with the tremendous guilt that the action of telling his manager there led to all of this. So that was another traumatic moment, I think, for people to see, and to see the impact that this had. He quit his job right away because he didn't think he was safe. And so it just,
he wasn't safe.
Right. It struck me when listening to the firefighter. There was also another video of her standing there by herself after the ambulance went away, and they asked her what she was thinking about, and it was some of the same shock. But she also said she stayed behind because she was afraid for the safety of Black men. She didn't want to leave Black men there alone with the Minneapolis Police Department. And that's why she stayed. And I think that speaks volumes, or it should speak volumes.
It does speak volumes, but as a Black woman, I'm also thinking you couldn't protect those Black men. I think it's a great gesture, and I don't want to undermine that, because I know a lot of white folks were just so excited about the testimony, you know, of the white female firefighter. But I was left thinking that sounded great to say, and you probably believe that, but you had no power to protect any Black men in those situations because of the culture of MPD, because they commit murder and have gotten away with it, and because people typically trust in them until they witness an incident like that. Because when she walked up, she thought, hey, you know, like, these are my comrades, let me check his pulse. And then she realized, as a woman in that situation, and a non-cop, that those privileges would not be extended to her. Mm-hmm. You know, so she felt powerless. I think whatever privilege she walked up with, knowing that she was in an official position for the city, was shattered when she realized she was treated just like the Black bystanders. Get over here, and yelled at by one of the cops in a very angry way. So it was great for her to say that. I'm sure she meant that, but she really couldn't protect Black men in that situation.
And I really appreciate that perspective, Nekima. Andrew, welcome back. We're talking about, you know, as you're hearing here, sorry about your tech issues. I did let folks know that you would be rejoining us. You know, it's really interesting to juxtapose, her perspective on wanting to be able to do that with what had just happened, right? A Black man had just been murdered while she was there. And the other thing that really strikes me, and I wonder, if we could comment on just, I know we've talked a little bit about like the defense theory here and why are they going after, really putting so much emphasis on like being name called and things like that, which just seems so trivial, to juxtapose that with what we've heard and seen from witnesses, like this incredible vulnerability and the pain and, the guilt that they feel from having been there, how deeply humanized these bystanders and witnesses, these children have been, and you try and juxtapose that with what it appears the defense is trying to do to sort of create this image, which quite frankly is again grounded in racist, white supremacy of the angry Black mob, right? The crowd, because we're at 38th in Chicago, right? And so just wonder if we might comment on that before we move to talk about some of the other witnesses.
I would love if Andrew can chime in, because I know he had to disappear for a little bit.
Sure, I can chime in real quick. And I think, so I had a response, Nekima, to the point you just made as well, which I think I can segue into the response to this specific question. But even as both you and Mary discussed the white firefighter, right? There was the non-white 911 dispatcher who testified, I think, first. And you saw the dismissiveness with which she was treated by her fellow, I don't know if officers is the right term to call it, but certainly from individuals within MPD. And I think to Sarah's question about the juxtaposition, I think you see that juxtaposition because law enforcement generally, and obviously MPD specifically in this case, they expect compliance. They expect that you will never question what they're doing. And when they don't get that, right, they don't know how to act. Or what they do is that they'll tell you that they're trained to respond with force, and that the use of force in those situations is reasonable because an individual or individuals wasn't compliant. And I think you see that reverberating throughout all ranks of MPD. I think you see how it gets reflected in the treatment of the firefighter that we saw. I think you see how it gets reflected in the treatment of what those officers were doing to the individuals who were the bystanders. And I think you see it in how dismissively the 911 dispatcher was treated as well. It's symptomatic of a culture within law enforcement that you then see reflected in them turning the blind eye to holding officers accountable, to holding people like Derek Chauvin accountable, because let's not forget, this is not the first time he's done something like this. It's just that this time someone died, right? There were multiple.
They died before, but this was on video and the world saw it.
Exactly. So that's my answer to that question. I'll turn it back over to Mary and Nekima for any further comments on that.
Well, I think to what we're saying that I want those who've tuned in to really think about is making sure that you're not falling into the trap of censoring whiteness and treating a white witness that you can identify with as a hero while discounting and undervaluing the immense amount of courage that it takes for a Black person to get on that stand and all of the dynamics in the community and families and the systemic racism and everything else, not to mention the trauma, to get up there and testify and be vulnerable. For some reason, with the comments that I saw on some of the news feeds, I saw people placing the white female firefighter on a pedestal. Did she do some great things? Yes, she did. But were they any different from what Darnella did or what Donald did? No. So we have to make sure that we're not engaging in that trap, because too often the voices of Black witnesses are not taken seriously and they're discounted. Just like in Jamar Clark's case, dozens of Black witnesses, police came on the scene. The witnesses were upset, they were agitated. The police pepper sprayed them and physically pushed them out of the way. And then Mike Freeman, when he made the decision to not charge those cops, he discounted their testimony as if it never even happened. So that is a part of this larger system that we're dealing with, that those of us who care about racial justice have to make sure that we are conscious of, so that we are not replicating the same white supremacy that we claim to hate.
You're making me think of the defense, I was going to say asking, but actually telling one of the prospective jurors twice that this case wasn't about race, which I thought was stunning, actually. I mean, he made some comments like that in his opening too about what it wasn't about, but to tell a juror it wasn't about race was an interesting perspective, a pretty offensive perspective, because in my mind, this case is all about race.
Right, but that's true because you've engaged the issue of race. And we're talking about a privileged white male attorney who represents cops for a living, and who has that law and order mindset, at least from what I can glean from the questions that he's asking, and how he's trying to disparage the community, bring up racial stereotypes about the crowd, and act as if they were just supposed to stand there and remain silent while the life is being choked out of George Floyd. I'm thinking, where do they do that? Like, where does that happen? First of all, it wouldn't have happened in Edina with a white man in a circumstance like that. It wouldn't have happened in Southwest Minneapolis. So why the standard for us is to remain silent in the face of that level of brutality and oppression, it behooves me. If anything, when we see something, we need to say something, and then we need to do something.
I think the answer to that question is that for a long time and consistently, and now and going into the future, that law enforcement, they don't care about Black voices, right? I think it's been often said that police violence is not a new thing. The thing that's new is that it's been recorded now, and those videos have been disseminated and are easily shareable. And so the videos allow, I think someone mentioned in the comments that it's important to realize that the majority of people in Minnesota are white. It's allowed white Minnesota and white members of the United States community generally to see what's been happening, because for far too long, they simply didn't believe Black people when they talked about what it was like to be Black and to be policed. And I think we're starting to reckon with that now, hopefully.
Thank you all so much for sharing those thoughts. As you talk about, what it means, and, I can't stop thinking about the testimony from Donald, was that his name? The MMA, the gentleman who's there, who has a background in MMA, and how the defense attorney kept asking him, but then you got you were getting angrier and angrier. And I think to your point, Nekima, but of course, right? Like, I mean, you're watching this man, you're choking the life out of this man in front of folks. Of course, they're going to get angry. And could you imagine a scenario where, first of all, if George Floyd was white, it would never have happened, right? So we have to say that as a baseline, but where the police are choking the life out of a white person, and an attorney feels they could stand up in front of a jury and ask a witness, but you were getting more angry, right? Like, as you watch that happen, because there's an acceptance of a level of anger about a white person, being murdered, right? But the way we devalue and dehumanize Black bodies in our Black community is really reflective in the way those questions, really just in the way the whole defense is being presented.
Absolutely, and the fact that the prosecution team has to ask the witnesses, well, did you get angry, or what were you feeling, to try to rehabilitate those witnesses after the defense attorneys have tried to cast aspersions on their character because they were upset. And I'm thinking, the places that I've grown up, if you think that's angry, they have no idea. That could not have happened in certain parts of this country. It just couldn't have. Just because some people are so far away from restraining themselves, against police in the way that those bystanders were. And I also thought about the level of aggression, which we really started to see in those bystander videos, particularly of Officer, is it Tao? Is how it's pronounced, Tao. And him yelling at people, telling people to get back, he was so aggressive. And then hearing people say, kids say, they put their hands on their mace, right? In a threatening gesture. And that was enough to keep people as much at bay as they possibly could. But you could tell that physically they wanted to figure out how to go save George Floyd and drag him out of that situation. You know, but we know that there would have been more fatalities if they had done that. And there would have been a whole other narrative in place if they had physically intervened. And they probably would be on their way to prison as a result.
You know, I was looking at a question here, the one that starts with plain devil's advocate, we're all defense lawyers kind of thing. And it hits on a point I've been thinking about a lot. We have been defense lawyers. We spend our careers defending people. And so I ask myself, how would I defend this case if I was in this position? And I find myself being angry at the way this case is being defended, because it's not the way I would defend it. And I worry too that the general public thinks, oh, this is what defense lawyers do. You know, they use, I mean, and some people do, but you, like, I look at this comment and it says, they're putting on a defense, the defendant is presumed innocent. When the facts aren't on your side, you argue everything else to create doubt. That's why the defense isn't pushing back right now. I mean, there's nothing really for the defense to push back on right now. If, you know, I look at this case, if you're going to go with causation, then you go with causation. And you also don't have to treat people with the disrespect I feel they've been treated with. You know, all of the witnesses with Donald Williams, other witnesses have been treated with disrespect. And the failure to recognize that this case is about race, the failure to recognize and treat all of the witnesses with empathy, we can do that as defense lawyers. And I think successful defense lawyers do that. We can empathize with the traumatic situation somebody's gone through, but still talk to them about whether they saw what they really saw. And so there is this part of me where I'm like, I am a defense lawyer. I've invested my career in this, and I would defend, but this isn't who I am. It really isn't. And I know a lot of I've been getting texts from public defender friends all over the country, like, what is this? And I do want the public to know this is not the way defense has to be. Defense, especially public defenders that I know of, many of them, you don't have to make, I would never say this isn't about race. And I know I'm going on here too, but it is this tension I feel about how defense is being represented in the very first televised case in the history of Minnesota. And this is how it has to come out, which is a big disservice, I think, to a lot of the defenders here. But Nekima, I think you had a really good point about how this is one of a group of defense lawyers who are hired by the Police Federation to defend police officers. But I'm wondering how you guys all feel about being defense lawyers and seeing a defense put on this way.
Well, I would say to the person who gave the question, I don't think the devil needs an advocate. I think he's busy enough, as we saw on May 25th, 2020. But I would not represent Derek Chauvin. I have to draw the line somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that is one of those places that they could never call me. And that's part of why I've chosen the various career paths that I've chosen, so that I can have flexibility in terms of what kind of cases I handle, what kind of cases I don't. That is an intentional decision on my part, so that I'm not in a situation where I would feel forced or pressured to defend someone like Derek Chauvin in that situation. But I agree with Mary that the defense does not have to be disrespectful in the way that he has been. But I also think that it's good for the nation to see what really happens in Minnesota. His attitude and his mentality around police officers being put on a pedestal and how their lives are seen as much more valuable than the life of the average person is as Minnesotan as it can get. That's how we got to this place in the first place, where so many people have been killed on our watch in this state, and only a small fraction of people ever raise their voices to do anything about it. So we can't hide behind this false notion of progressivism when the reality of the white supremacy and the racism and the fact that 3 Black circus workers were lynched in Duluth over a false rape allegation is a part of this history. Not to mention the theft of indigenous land, which is one aspect of the foundation of Minnesota that doesn't get addressed, but the level of brutality, dehumanization of Native people, and barbarism that played a role in that has to do with the culture here as well. And it's something people don't talk about, but it's the reality of what Black and Indigenous and other people of color have experienced.
Andrew, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about your perspective on, and the perspective of the Legal Rights Center. I mean, we are a community nonprofit law firm with lawyers that practice defense work. Andrew and I are both former public defenders. So Andrew, do you want to jump in on this at all before we move on?
I mean, I think what I'll add just real quickly as a corollary to Mary's point is that in my trial practice, and I've been in that courtroom, I've been in front of Judge Cahill, for example, in trial cases. In my trial practice, I truly believe that there is value in every witness, whether those are state witnesses or whether those are defense witnesses. And I think to Nekima's point and to what Mary said earlier as well, I think what you're seeing reflected in this case is that you have a defense attorney who doesn't seem to want to value anything that a state's witness is saying. And, the question has to be why, right? Because it can't just be a strategic issue. There are other underlying issues, I think, with respect to race, with respect to how law enforcement sees Black people, that you're seeing. And as in the confrontation he had with the firefighter, for example, I think there are questions about how you approach his gender, right? And outside of that, as a defense attorney, it's not just the questioning that you have control over, right? Mary mentioned this earlier, but you have control over talking to your client and having them have an appreciation for what it looks like to be in front of a jury. And I can only imagine the conversations that Eric Nelson, Derek Chauvin would have had about how to present on TV, right? And to the extent that those conversations aren't happening, or you're not seeing them reflected in a way that seems to underscore the gravity of the situation, I think those are still things that could happen, that we could comment on, that people need to take note of as well.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I appreciate the dialogue on this. There have been, I could also go on as a defense attorney, but I'm going to restrain myself here because I think it's been well answered. There's been a lot of questions about what do folks think about the way Judge Cahill has handled this trial. I know many of us have appeared in front of him. There's been questions about the way he admonished the female firefighter, just general questions about how he's handled the trial thus far. So I wonder if we could jump over to that topic.
Andrew, you were just talking about having been in front of him quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to say this because Cahill is clearly frustrated, right? And I'm not entirely sure that all of his frustration is wrapped up in the performance of the attorneys or the witnesses. I think he has always presented to me as a judge and a person who wants things to keep moving. And he gets really upset when things get bogged down, right? He's admonished, by my recollection anyway, he's admonished several of the witnesses now. And I think where questions of fairness come into play is that I don't think you necessarily see the same level of admonishment for the attorneys, except having been in those chambers and in those courtrooms, my guess would be that some of that is going on behind the scenes. I just don't know because we're not seeing it in public, right? What we're seeing is him admonishing the witnesses who I think outside of the firefighter were all Black or people of color, I think. So you see him admonishing Black people, basically, not admonishing the attorneys involved. And so I can understand the questions of fairness, right? I just have to imagine that there have been a number of conversations going on behind the scenes with the attorneys with respect to grandstanding, with respect to acting out in court, because as I said, I've been in front of him. So I've had that conversation with him myself. But it looks unfair because you see him admonishing just Black people. And I think that's problematic and maybe something that someone needs to point out to him so that they can figure out a way to correct it if it is something that they actually care about.
Well, Andrew, you remember we have in common appearing before Judge Cahill when 11 of us were charged as organizers of the Mall of America demonstration back in December of 2014. So Judge Cahill oversaw that case. Andrew was one of our defense attorneys representing the 11 of us, and I was co-counsel in my own defense as well as a defendant in that case. I thought that he handled that case fairly. I could be biased because after 11 months, our charges were dismissed. But he, it definitely was not anywhere near the level of attention and publicity as what we see happening with this case. But for Minnesota, it was a big deal because of the, start of the movement and everybody paying attention and all the people who were angry about us shutting down the mall. But I felt that he did his best to strike a balance in that situation. Now, I do know that he's under a tremendous amount of pressure because the world is watching. And I think that he wants to appear a certain way as a judge. He wants to end this process with his level of respect intact. And it is a fine line, especially when it comes to looking at who is being admonished and why, and whether it's actually justified in this situation.
Yeah, I think, well, I know he was personally handpicked for this, partly because of his trial management skills, which are critical for a case like this. I think he's been very thoughtful in his decision making. I think he does have a temper. We've seen that directed once at the media, and we've seen it mostly directed at the city council in Minneapolis for the press conferences and for creating publicity, which has caused some issues with jurors. And then we saw it with some witnesses. And I wondered yesterday if when he admonished the firefighter, was partly because he had just learned that there was a video, a woman had taken a video on the 18th floor. But I don't think it was appropriate what he did. I don't think it's appropriate to admonish witnesses in the way he has, because they have no reason to know what special rules we have in court. And especially, the defense lawyer yesterday would ask a question and then say yes or no. And some of those questions couldn't be answered yes or no. And so they're just different rules in court, and lay people should be treated respectfully. If you feel that you have to explain something to them, you could excuse the jury, and especially when the cameras are on, too, that you can just explain, this is how the rules work in a courtroom. I get it's different from what you're used to. I think he's been very kind to the jurors during jury selection, which is really helpful because I think it's enabled them to be more forthright. The one thing that sticks in my mind, which isn't necessarily wrong on his part, but I wished for better, which goes back to juror 76, the Black man who I thought was incredibly insightful and should have been on this jury, but he was excused by the defense for what was characterized as bias against MPD, which was an interesting, well, not interesting. The witness was talking about, as a Black man experiencing discrimination every day, which is the truth. That's his lived experience. And then he was also talking about something that was probably pretty astonishing for people listening, not so much for many people But the fact that when a Black man was killed, MPD would roll through 38th in Chicago with another one bites the dust. And that was something mentioned by the defense as a reason that this witness or this potential juror was biased against MPD. And it's kind of like, well, what white person standing there listening to MPD doing something as egregious and appalling as that wouldn't say that and have an opinion about MPD? And he wasn't biased against MPD. He had lived experiences. And so when I knew that the defense was going to excuse him, they had a sidebar and you couldn't hear anything that they were saying. And the defense lawyer asked for him to be excused for cause because of the bias, and that wasn't granted. He did excuse him with a peremptory, and I was really disappointed that the state didn't challenge it on Batson grounds. The state actually said, well, I'm disappointed you've excused this juror because it seems to be based on his lived experiences. And I don't know, I don't think I've ever met a Black man in Minneapolis who hasn't had a negative experience with the police. So I think the law pretends you can separate race. I mean, the law clearly says you cannot be removed from a jury because of your race. But we seem to have this strange idea that you can separate lived experience from race. And that was just this point where I was waiting for Cahill, wishing, maybe it was completely wishful, that Cahill would say, you know what? No, this juror is a perfectly fine juror to be on here. And I'm not going to let you excuse him because all of the things he's talked about are based on his lived experiences as a Black man. And that is about race. So, you know, what I would say is probably any judge would have done the same thing, I'm guessing. But I had this glimmering hope that he would step up and do something different. And I hope some judge does that someday. But that's something that continues to bother me about jury selection. Nekima's thinking, well, you're going to be waiting a long time.
No, I'm taking in what you're saying about that. And I was thinking about the Black woman who got dismissed early on, who said she saw the video, she can't unsee it, she's impacted by it. And the judge himself used, you know, his authority to have her removed from the jury. Mm-hmm. And it made me wonder what level of cultural competency Judge Cahill has, but I don't know him well enough, you know, to know whether he has worked through, you know, some of the underlying racial issues before becoming a judge or while becoming a judge. I mean, I don't know where he would have learned it. You know, I know law school doesn't typically teach it. And he was a defense attorney and a prosecutor in Hennepin County under Amy Klobuchar. So I don't know what he could have picked up, you know, in that situation, to be honest.
We did get a question from our chat here asking, what do you think has been the impact thus far or will be going forward from the live streaming of this trial? I mean, this is a first in Minnesota, and I think we've touched on it a little bit already about like the trauma and the impact that it's having, but wonder if there's you know, specific thoughts about how it maybe is impacting the trial proceedings, you know, the witnesses and what we can expect going forward with that.
I would just say that Minnesota is really far behind in terms of having cameras in the courtroom and televising trials. I mean, for those of us who watched, you know, even some years back when Trayvon Martin was killed, we got to watch that trial live when George Zimmerman was on trial. I'm thinking back to, you know, trials in Los Angeles that were televised. That was just a normal thing for us. So I think I've heard from international journalists and journalists from other states that there are far more restrictions here in terms of what they can and cannot do, you know, in the courtroom. And that was pretty baffling to them as well. And I know he's been upset by some of the things that have happened with journalists, but they're looking at other places that are far more advanced in terms of how they address these situations. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm hoping that people are learning through the process of watching the trial. But you also have to have spaces like this, like the one the Legal Rights Center has created, where we can help unpack and deconstruct and analyze issues that you're not necessarily going to understand just watching from your television set, especially if you don't have a legal background or if you don't focus on racial justice issues. Some of those things can fly right over people's heads.
Yeah, the district court has, depending on who the chief judge, assistant chief judge, has been fairly hostile and fairly non-transparent. They've been very hostile to the media this time around. And I think that's caused some problems because the media is important to educate the public. And I still, as I sit here, I'm of two minds. Like the defense lawyer in me is kind of like, I fear the impact of cameras on jurors, on lawyers, and on witnesses, because jurors decide cases based on whether they think witnesses are being truthful. And they look at like, are you nervous and that kind of thing. And so there's this part of me that still wants cameras to go away, but there's a big part of me too, and it may be growing bigger, that, you know, for the first time ever, the public was able to watch jury selection and see what actually happens and see what those issues are. And they've been able to watch parts of the trial the last couple of days and see what some of the issues are. And so maybe in some respect, this will lead to some changes that we desperately need in the court system, because the public now knows what some of the problems are. So I still have a little bit of that. I do worry about the impact, but it is good to shine a light on things that I think the courts would just as soon not have out there in the public.
Right. I would say that even with the public watching, and even as the public sees biases within the criminal justice system, they're not just going to wake up and run out there and change things, right? Mm-hmm. Most of the time people see these things, they're aware of them, but nothing really happens unless people roll up their sleeves and actually make it happen in order to change what we don't like about this particular process. I'm also thinking about this notion of accessibility for people of color who may not feel comfortable coming to Hennepin County District Court for very obvious reasons, who can now, from the comfort and safety of their living room, observe what's going on. So that, or people with disabilities as well, people with health impacts who cannot, you know, physically go out. I think that it's a good thing for some of those reasons.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that we forget sometimes that court is supposed to be a public space. And as Nekima pointed out, Minnesota has a long history of being very adverse to this type of change. And I think for a lot of very good reasons, because, you know, as Mary alluded to as well, especially as defense attorneys, you can be a little squeamish about this type of change because it's exposing the clients that we typically work with, who are, let's not forget, who are often marginalized people of color, to a lot of scrutiny that may or may not be warranted. But at the end of the day, the court is a public space. And to the extent I think that we are now allowing cameras into the courtroom in Minnesota, I would at least hope that you're going to start to see some of the more systemic changes, because now people hopefully are better educated, or at least better aware of the right questions to ask, right? Because before this trial, when we were talking about jury selection, how many members of the community would even know the right questions to ask? Very few people. And I think that's a sea change in the landscape here in terms of how we approach, you know, whether you want to talk about reform, whether you want to talk about abolition, whether you want to talk about wholesale systemic changes, right? That's a big change in how we approach all of those things, because now we're talking about more members of the community being able to ask the right questions.
I don't know how much you guys have worked in the area of systemic change. I just haven't seen it happen like that. I'm telling you guys, I'm not trying to be like, you know, a pessimist here, but just the reality is that people, how often do we admire this conversation around racial disparities? And how often have you seen people actually roll up their sleeves and do anything about it? Whether it's criminal justice, whether it's right in your face, whether it's whatever. I mean, how many people are actually getting involved and getting engaged and pushing for systemic changes? Very, very few. So I don't expect it to change unless a movement builds, just like the one that we have here that started focusing very intentionally on the issue of state-sanctioned violence. And, you know, we've been relentless, taking to the streets, doing what we have to do. And that's how we got here. It didn't happen because people knew that police violence was going on. It happened because people actually developed an appetite to begin to challenge what was happening. So I hope that happens, but until we see people step forward, I think we'll continue to process what we're witnessing.
Well, and I so appreciate that, Nekima. And I think, you know, from where I sit, facilitating this conversation and in my role at the Legal Rights Center, I'm really looking forward to continuing to invite you and Mary and Andrew back to these conversations, even beyond the Chauvin trial, right? I mean, these are the conversations that we need to continue to have. And I think we will look forward, hopefully, to having you join us for a conversation about how can we continue to push towards systemic change, you know, beyond when all the national media goes home, right? And the spotlight isn't there anymore, but we're still here, you know, experiencing, you know, in our Black communities and Indigenous communities and communities of color, still experiencing this deeply traumatic harm of our criminal legal system. You know, we'll still be here, and we will look forward to continuing to engage with all the folks who have joined us these past few weeks and months. I think, you know, there's a question I'd like to ask you all about the trial. You know, we're 3 days into evidence. So, you know, we've got a lot of folks on here watching. What are you hoping that they'll be paying attention to over the next few days and weeks of this trial? What would you point people to? Because we will be back, but we're not here every day. So what should people be watching coming up?
I would say there's going to be a lot of testimony about use of force policy and training, which should be revealing, because you've got the state telling us that Chauvin was not trained and this isn't part of the policy. And then you have the defense saying he did exactly what he was trained to do. So I would watch out for the use of force discussions. I think there'll be quite a few witnesses on that. And then, as I mentioned before, the medical testimony, I think, will be critical. Those are the two remaining critical points, I think, left in the trial.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm really watching for both of those things. I'm curious to see what's going to happen when Chief Madera Arredondo takes the stand and argues that Derek Chauvin was never trained to keep his knee on someone's neck for as long as he did. I'm sure that there's going to be some evidence that tries to refute that, including this whole notion of excited delirium that's going to come forward. That is a really bogus diagnosis, but it's one that the Hennepin County medical system sort of stands behind and helps to train police officers around this notion of excited delirium. So that is going to come in as well. And then I'm wondering if they're going to present any information about the warrior training that the Police Federation offered and that officers could take for a long time, and see if they try to associate that specifically with MPD. Because just last week, when Minneapolis police were trying to shut down a homeless encampment, there was a still from one of the videos that showed an officer placing his knee on someone's neck who was hanging over a curb. And so they had to learn that somewhere. I mean, I don't know what's going to come forward in terms of where Derek Chauvin learned that technique that he used.
Yeah, I think Nekima and Mary kind of have it covered. I too am very interested to see what the chief's testimony looks like. You know, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'm concerned by, I think, the prospect for trauma of having the testimony about the autopsy come in and how that's going to be displayed to the public. But ultimately, I am really very interested to see how the defense presents its case. To kind of put a bow on everything that we've talked about so far, it has certainly come off, and I'm being charitable here, it's come off as being very tone deaf. And we've talked about, I think, why that is, and maybe it's just that they don't care. But I'm really interested to see how that develops through the pendency of the trial.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I just want to thank you all again so much for coming tonight to be with us and to help us unpack this for our community. I do want to say we've gotten a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer because we just don't have enough time. And so we will go live at the Legal Rights Center on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter in the next week with some of our attorneys to answer these questions. I had wanted to give Nekima a little bit of space to talk about justice in the context of this trial. She wrote an amazing piece for, I believe it was for BET.com. We can highlight that on our social media, but Nekima, just really, we only have a couple moments, but if you have any last quick words on, just what you shared there, it was very powerful.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to read it. And I guess the main takeaway from that article is saying that nothing less than a second-degree murder conviction will do in this case, because we all saw that video. I see this trial, in all honesty, as a formality. We know what we witnessed. And as the prosecution said, we need to believe our eyes. We need to believe what we saw. And not be fooled by some of the shenanigans that happen in the courtroom in terms of understanding what this is, and the fact that ultimately George Floyd died over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. That became a death sentence, and part of why it became a death sentence is because of the culture of MPD that we have allowed to persist for many years that led to this particular situation. So I just want us to stay focused and remember George Floyd, and remember that none of this ever had to happen in the first place if he had been seen as a human being.
Well, thank you, Nekima. And I think Malika just dropped the link for folks who want to read that article right into the chat there. We're going to just put up here, we have a couple things coming up here. We will come back together, and hopefully Mary and Nekima will join us again for another forum. So watch your email and social media for when we'll get that scheduled. But we're holding weekly community processing circles with our restorative practices facilitators. It's online Fridays at 4 o'clock, so we welcome you to join us. And then actually next Wednesday, we're going to hold a youth forum with youth leaders in our community to talk about their perspectives and their experience. And so we'll be online with that. And as I mentioned, we'll be coming back with another forum like this in the next week or two. Also, it's been referenced in the chat, but we have a lot of resources on our website about what's happening in the trial to understand the trial process, the medical evidence. Nekima mentioned the excited delirium piece that's coming up. We just filmed that last week, and we hope to be able to drop that on the website in the next day or two here to help folks understand the racist history of that, that excited delirium and how it might be used in this case. So please check out our website and please continue to come back with us. And Mary, Nekima, Andrew, can't thank you all enough for your time and expertise tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the attendees.